afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Lunch and Learn for today. We are happy to have with us Jeff Hawks from the U.S. Army Heritage Center Foundation. Jeff has been the Director of Education and Veterans Outreach for the Army Heritage Center Foundation. In that capacity, he oversees numerous educational and community programs, including teacher workshops, a Veterans Oral History Project, the Soldier Experience Adventure Camp, the Veterans Cafe, and National History Day in Pennsylvania. Jeff is a certified public school teacher with 20 years of experience teaching in secondary and higher education. He previously served as an adjunct professor of political science at the University of Connecticut and Eastern Connecticut State University. Jeff also holds a BA in philosophy and a master's in political science with a concentration in political theory, international relations, and American politics from the University of Connecticut. His previous work experience includes serving as a dispatcher and student patrol unit for Yukon Police Department and managing the coffee shops at the University of Connecticut. Jeff is a veteran of the United States Army. He served 4 years in infantry on deployment that includes 10 patrols on the DMZ in Korea, fighting forest fires in Oregon, and 6 months in Saudi Arabia and Iraq during Operation Desert Storm. So, Jeff, welcome, and we're going to turn the program over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Kathy, for that great introduction. Thank you, Nicole and William, for helping run the program today. And thanks to everyone at the State Library for the invitation to come speak. And thank you to all the audience members who have joined us today. I see that we have at least one person that I know to be a veteran. So hopefully, if you are a veteran, especially if you're a veteran of the Gulf War, please send us a note in the chat so we can acknowledge your service and thank you for that. So what I'm going to be talking about today is the Gulf War, but I'm actually going to go back in history quite a bit because really the success of the United States Army in the Gulf War has its roots in the post-Vietnam era. So let me give me a minute here as I get my tech settled here. I apologize in advance. We got our tech updated to the new versions of Microsoft Office. And so some of the features are a little bit different and I'm finding they're a little bit clunky. So let me get this going. All right, you should be able to see my screen there. All right. Operation Desert Storm. A few caveats and a few things of sort of personal note, both for myself and for my fellow citizens of Pennsylvania. I am a Desert Storm veteran. That is a photograph of me sitting on top of a burned out Iraqi armored vehicle in Kuwait City. That's my 9th Infantry Division patch. I had a kind of interesting story in that I was an infantryman in the 9th Infantry Division, which was being inactivated due to the drawdown at the end of the Cold War. And when the Gulf War kicked off, they found that there were some reserve units and National Guard units that needed extra people. So they pulled me over and I got sent over to Desert Storm as a truck driver. And this photograph here, I hope you can see my cursor. This photograph here down in the lower right-hand corner is the view I had of much of the theater from the cab of my truck. We were hauling fuel. But there's also a strong connection for Pennsylvania. And this picture in the lower left-hand corner is the barracks compound at a place called Ajan, which was an industrial complex, warehouse complex in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia. And this is the barracks that was hit by a Scud missile on the 25th of February. And there was a unit there, the 14th Quartermaster Detachment, which is a United States Army Reserve water purification unit that was stationed in Greensburg, Pennsylvania. They had been activated for Desert Storm. They had been in country for a total of 6 days. And they took that night when that Scud missile struck, they took the highest percentage of casualties. Excuse me. Yes, the highest percentage of casualties of any unit in Operation Desert Storm. 81% of the unit's 69 soldiers had been killed or wounded. 13 soldiers were killed. So, you know, it's very personal for me, and it's also very poignant for Pennsylvania. So I like to put that out at the beginning as sort of full disclosure. Unfortunately, well, you know, it does mean that I can never be a totally objective historian of Desert Storm, but hopefully with some diligence and some care, I can offer you an interesting perspective that will help expand your understanding of Desert Storm. What do people think about when they think about Desert Storm? It was a very interesting experience for me to come back and find that people had been reading the news and watching the news. And in many ways, folks understood the war a lot better than I did because I saw my own very small, narrow piece of it. But I think that when people think of Desert Storm, they tend to think of the wildly successful air campaign. They think of General Schwarzkopf. They think of a breakneck pace for the ground campaign, soldiers in desert camouflage, and the utter devastation, such as exemplified by the Highway of Death. And in a lot of respects, you know, there's a lot of truth there, but there's a lot going on behind the scenes. The title of the official Army history of the war is Certain Victory. And while I do think that, you know, things were set up so that we really, it was really probably not possible for us to lose, there's a lot more to it than that. It was a certain victory, but in a lot of ways it wasn't a certain victory. And so I like to tell the story just to get started, to put everything in perspective, that I call No Easy Victory. And this is the story of Lieutenant Colonel Frank Hancock, now retired Colonel Frank Hancock, and the 101st Airborne in the seizure of Bob Cobra. Now, because we're limited on time, I won't go into tremendous details about this, but I do have a link to an article he's written about his experience, which I'll post in the chat room when I get a moment at the end of my presentation. So picture this, we're 48 hours out from what is going to be the largest air mobile operation in Army history. The 101st Airborne is going to fly 90 miles into Iraq and seize a position that's called Forward Operating Base Cobra. They're going to set up a refueling station. The ground convoys are going to follow on, and that's going to be used as a springboard to continue to leapfrog further into Iraq. And the 18th Airborne Corps, which the 101st is a part, they're off on the left flank. And their goal is to isolate the theater of operations so that the Republican Guard can't get out, and so that reinforcements can't get in. 48 hours out, and this is a huge, huge endeavor. There's going to be hundreds of helicopters in the air. There's going to be hundreds of vehicles moving on the ground. There's going to be artillery fire. There's going to be rocket fire. There's going to be Air Force sorties overhead. And about 48 hours out, Colonel Hancock's two intelligence guys, a Captain Delgado and a Sergeant Gonzalez, call him into their tent, and they say, "Sir, we've been looking at the intelligence reports, the reconnaissance reports. This plateau we're going to has an enemy trench line on it." And he says, "No problem, it's been checked out. There's nobody there. The trench line is empty." And they say, "Sir, we don't believe it's empty." And they produced some intelligence that they'd gotten a hold of, and they convinced Colonel Hancock that nobody builds a mile-long trench out in the middle of the desert and doesn't put anybody in it. They convince him of this. Now, he is the commander of the lead battalion. He's leading the way. They're going to be the first ones landing on the drop zone. And he goes up to his brigade commander and says, "Sir, I want to move my landing zone back a mile so that we don't come in right on top of this trench, because I think there's somebody there." Well, his brigade commander doesn't want to hear anything about it. He thinks Frank is getting cold feet. And he says, "Colonel Hancock, you've had your orders, carry them out." They have a rather heated discussion, but at the end of it, Colonel Hancock is told, "Carry out your orders," and he leaves the tent and heads back to his battalion area. The next morning, he gets word from his brigade commander that he's been given permission to move back his landing zone a mile. And when they get there, they find out that the trench is occupied. There's a battalion of Iraqi troops, about 350 troops in there, with heavy anti-aircraft machine guns. Make a long story short, it would have made for a very difficult day for Colonel Hancock if he had landed right on top of that. Those heavy machine guns, 57 millimeter anti-aircraft guns, would have made short works out of his Blackhawks. There would have been helicopters shot out of the sky. There would have been men trapped on the ground. There would have been heavy casualties. And so the story of Desert Storm would have been very different just on that basis alone. If the 101st had gone in and their first attack had turned into a bloodbath. And I tell you this because we tend to look at the outcome of battles and think that they were a foregone conclusion. And this is a pretty clear example of two soldiers who did their job, did their duty, did their diligence, and prevented a tragedy from happening. It's a remarkable feat what they did. It also speaks very highly of the Army, that they trained junior officers and junior NCOs well enough that they took the initiative to do that. It also speaks very highly of the Army that senior leaders listened to that. I like to contrast that with a movie that many people have seen, A Bridge Too Far, where they depict, it's dramatized for Hollywood purposes, but they do depict an individual who raises concerns about enemy units on the ground during Operation Market Garden that are ignored. And so it's a remarkable thing that these soldiers did it, and that their commanders listened, and that they modified the plan at the last minute, changed a huge change, required extensive coordination, but the Army did it and avoided a bloodbath. So keep that in mind as we talk up further as we go through this program. But so what I want to do is I want to go back a little bit and take a look at the post-Vietnam Army. There's a scene from the movie Stripes, which if you talk to a lot of people who served in the 1970s, will tell you is surprisingly accurate in some of its depictions of soldiers. The post-Vietnam Army was significantly demoralized. There were drug problems, there were alcohol problems, there were race riots. Over in Europe, it got so bad, you talk to some of the officers who served there, that some of the barracks were essentially run by gangs. And duty officers were literally issued sidearms and would take them before they entered the barracks. Some barracks you simply did not enter at night because they didn't take to that kind of interference. The units in Europe had been drained of men and material to support Vietnam. And so the Army was in pretty rough shape. Not only that, but the public perception of the Army was pretty poor as well. Generally speaking, the public perceived the Army as full of soldiers who were low class, poor, or uneducated. The belief was that discipline was harsh, and that duties are routine and boring, and that pay is low, housing conditions are poor. And so as the Army began to transition to this all-volunteer force, they had a real problem, which is how do you attract soldiers to serve in this kind of Army? So the Army is facing this problem as they transition to an all-volunteer force. And in the middle of this, a significant historic event occurs. Now, I can't survey, I don't have time to survey all of the military, um, uh, 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 all the things that happened during the period between the end of Vietnam and the Gulf War. But I do want to focus on one that was pretty significant, and that was the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. And what this war did was it gave Army planners an opportunity to really see what the new battlefield was like, because it wasn't an insurgent war like Vietnam. This was force on force in large scale conventional operations, which the Army is usually planning to engage in. And one of the, just to expedite the explanation here, I want to take a look at a particular weapon system, the Sagger missile. And what the Sagger missile was, is it became emblematic of the challenges posed by advances in enemy firepower, mostly in the guided munitions. And so the Sagger missile is this little man-portable. It fits into 2 suitcase-sized boxes. You see them here in the picture. You see the missile itself and the guidance system. And a small crew can carry this thing out on the battlefield, set it up in about 5 minutes, and it fires a wire-guided anti-tank missile, and which can kill a tank out to 300 meters. And while this missile is primitive by our modern standards, what the devastation of the Arab-Israeli War showed is that these new precision missiles, combined with the precision targeting systems on tanks and helicopters, really changed the lethality of the battlefield. And we began to realize that the new battlefield is going to chew up men and equipment a lot faster than what we're used to. The old battlefield. So we've got this going on. We've got the problems with the Army going on. How does the Army respond? The first thing is the Army has to get control of the all-volunteer force. Many were concerned when it was instituted that the all-volunteer force would not work. Recruiting was a really underdeveloped area. You don't really need a whole lot of recruiting when you have the draft. So the Army did not have a whole lot of resources dedicated to recruiting. The Guard and Reserves were at full strength, full of folks who were seeking to avoid Vietnam. But the Army conducted a number of studies and experiments trying to figure out what it was that they needed to do to start getting those recruiting numbers. When it transitioned in 1973, the all-volunteer force, how do we get it? And the problem was the Army was not making its manpower goals. So what did they need to do? The one thing they learned is they needed to increase soldier pay, and that is always expensive. The number one item in the Army budget is pay and benefits for soldiers. But at the time, soldiers were extremely poorly paid, and they realized that they can't attract people into the military if the pay is so low. They also discovered that soldiers didn't like the menial tasks. The old image of soldiers sitting around peeling potatoes or raking leaves or mowing lawns, those were all a feature of the conscripted Army. And the Army realized soldiers don't want to join the Army to do these things. They want to join the Army to be soldiers. So the Army had to get rid of those things. They found that strict discipline was also a negative. So the Army began revising its disciplinary procedures as they began to professionalize the force. Relaxed uniform and personal grooming standards, they had to address that as well. They found it was really hard for the Army to find the happy medium on that. They sometimes found that relaxing them too far created more problems than it solved. They also found that they started offering weekends off. Soldiers would not work 7 days a week. They wanted their weekends off. And so by the time I joined the Army in 1988, for most of the Army, it was a 5-day-a-week job unless there was training going on. And it wasn't quite 9 to 5. You got up at 6 in the morning and did your physical training. But by 5 o'clock in the afternoon, you were, unless you had some kind of special duty, you were usually off and had the time to yourself. And then the Army focused on better food, better barracks, and better family housing. But one of the things that this transition enabled, and this was so critical in the Gulf War, was that the force became more professional, and training and professionalism were absolutely key in the victory in Desert Storm, because you start having soldiers. First off, you don't need to have as harsh discipline if you can appeal to their sense of professionalism, but you start getting soldiers and NCOs who understand their jobs better, can adapt to changes, and have a better sense of what it is that they're supposed to be doing, so that they can kind of implement on the fly and make things happen. Now, I want to stop sharing this for a moment and share something else with you. I want to take a look at of the Be All You Can Be commercials. And I just want you to take a look at these and tell me, think about what's being portrayed.
You're reaching deep inside you, things you've never known. It's been tough, rough going, but you haven't gone alone.
We do more before 9 a.m. than most people do all day.
All that you can
Hey, First Sergeant. Good morning.
find your future in the Army.
Okay, so that
A ranger never takes
The easy way out.
You're reaching deep.
So that first commercial shows, I mean, the Army is exciting, it's professional, it's racially integrated, and there's a relaxation. He ends it up, he's drinking his coffee and he's having a friendly chat with his first sergeant. These are all things that are countering those negative perceptions of the Army. Now watch this one. This one is one of the ones that appealed to me when I was a teenager.
Deep inside you, for things you've never known. Go!
That's why getting into the Rangers is tough, and the training is tough.
Be all that you can be.
So it makes me feel like I'm part of something really special.
Be all that you can be.
And I'm not the only one.
Get an edge on life in the Army.
So again, here you have, you're going to be doing exciting things. You're going to fly home in a Learjet. Mom and dad are going to be really proud of you. Again, this is getting the Army past this negative image that it had after the Vietnam War. One more I want to show you here. I think it's this one. Yeah, here we go.
Computer expertise, son. So you finally gave in. Yeah, for starters, how does the disk fit into the disk drive? Okay.
The Army can train you to program, operate, or fix computers.
What does the printer interface do? It lets the computer talk to the printer. They talk to each other. What do they say? And then there's a telephone modem hookup.
And the computer training you get is yours forever.
Be all that you can be.
Like you're not going to be the only computer expert in the family.
Get an edge on life in the Army.
Okay, so again, here in this, we're seeing a really different view of the Army. So you've got this guy, he's young, he's wearing a business suit. It's a uniform, but it's a business suit. He's going to work in a tie. He's working in a clean office. He's learning how to use computers. Look at his family. That's an upper middle class family. Dad's got his cardigan and his little reading glasses on. They've bought a computer. That was an expensive thing back when that commercial came out. So you've got the Be All You Can Be commercials, the advertising campaign, and they're trying to attract that kind of soldier, that kind of recruit. The Army raises its recruiting standards, and you start to see this development of a really highly professional force. At the same time, the Army is letting more women in. So you have the 2% restriction that restricted the number of women allowed in the Army to 2% of the total force. That is lifted. They've become part of the Army proper. They're being so it's no longer the Women's Army Corps, the Army Nurse Corps. They're actually joining the Army. They're being allowed to. They're being given small arms training. They're opening more jobs. and the restriction lifted, and women started at West Point in 1976. And unless I'm mistaken, we have one of those graduates here with us today. By the time Desert Storm rolled around, women represented 8.6% of the troops that were deployed to Desert Storm. 26,000 women were sent to Saudi Arabia and Iraq and Kuwait. And the Army also began serious work to address sexual harassment and assault. So the Army is changing. The quality of the soldiers is changing. And the way that the Army deals with soldiers is changing. At the same time, the Army is revamping how it fights wars. And there's a real debate going on over blood versus treasure. Do we spend blood or do we spend money? And this is because the Army has a bad history of losing its first battles. If you look at Bull Run in the Civil War, Kasserine Pass in the Second World War, Belleau Woods in the First World War, Task Force Smith in Korea, the Ia Drang Valley in Vietnam. The Army had a habit of doing fairly poorly in its first outings in any new war, and then absorbing the costs in terms of lives lost and learning from that and learning how to fight during that battle. The Army is looking at that and saying, we can't do that anymore. They're looking at the reality of the reduced force after Vietnam, but they're also looking at the fact that, and I'm going to talk about this in a little bit, but we're outnumbered by the Soviets. We're going to be outnumbered by the Soviets. We cannot afford to lose that first battle if the Cold War turns hot and we get that first battle on the plains of Germany. We can't afford to lose that, because by the time we can recover, we'll be pushed all the way back to France or worse. And so the Army starts learning how to anticipate the next war. They develop something called air-land battle, which is a new way of fighting. So what the Army did was this new process of looking forward and anticipating how the next war would be fought and developing the weapons needed to do it. And really the two options existed, and this was the blood versus treasure debate. Lots of cheap weapons and masses of soldiers, or a smaller force of highly trained professional soldiers using expensive high-tech weapons capable of dominating the battlefield. Now, there's a number of problems here. One, the likely battlefield is, as I mentioned, Western Europe, which means that reinforcements are weeks away. And that's assuming that the Soviets didn't manage to close the Atlantic to those reinforcement convoys. Problem two, as we've seen, the new battlefield was far deadlier than in previous wars. And problem three is that American citizens were opposed to the reinstatement of the draft, meaning that the force that we would have would likely be very small compared to the armies of the past. These problems meant that there was just no chance we could achieve anything close to numerical parity with the Soviets. Their ability to mobilize troops wasn't dependent upon public opinion. And they had, the old saying goes, is the Soviets have kept every piece of equipment they've ever had going back to the Great War, and can brush them off and put them into the battlefield if they need to. We can't afford to lose that first battle. And so the Army chose the high-tech route. So that was the decision in terms of the weapons and equipment, which we're going to talk about on the next slide. At the same time, they said we need new organization and new strategies to be able to fight outnumbered and win. The total force policy reflected the fact that many of our strategic planners believed that the failure to activate our reserves in Vietnam was a mistake. It sent the wrong message to the enemies that we weren't committed to winning the war, and that we didn't have the will to fight. And there was a concern that with the all-volunteer force, we would increase the civilian gap. And so the National Guard and Reserves, and I'll have a graphic on this in a few slides, but the National Guard and Reserves were restructured so that a lot of the support units that the Army would need to go to war were shifted into the reserves, so that essentially, if we went to war, we would have to activate the reserves. It would not be possible to deploy. Now, this made sense for a number of reasons. One of them being that, for example, the 14th Quartermaster Detachment, the Army doesn't need a water purification unit most of the time. They can get, during training, they have access to all the fresh water they need. But during wartime, that becomes important. So that unit was placed in the reserves so that it would be activated when we deployed into a theater where they were necessary. It avoided duplication in the active force and saved money for modernization, which had been postponed for many years. The modernization program was very important. In the 1970s, we really realized that our tanks were already obsolete, our helicopters were obsolete. We were not, in fact, fielding the most advanced weaponry in the world. We had a significant disadvantage over some of our potential enemies. The resulting doctrine was this air-land battle concept, which was the idea that we're going to fight the enemy, we're going to fight them close, we're going to fight them deep, and we're going to fight them rear. So the frontline battle was still important, but the overall strategy had to involve attacking the enemy deep in the rear to disrupt their supplies, interdict reinforcements, and destroy their command and control. So the close meant large tactical formations using maneuver to close combat and fire support to engage and defeat the enemy at the forward edge of the battlefield. Deep, you have to win the battle through deception, surveillance, intelligence, interdiction of reserves. You isolate the battlefield. You choose where, when, and how, and with whom the next battle will be fought. These are critical elements of, and those of us in central Pennsylvania are actually fairly familiar with that. If you're familiar with Gettysburg and you understand the importance of Meade occupying the high ground after the first day of battle. But the Army starts training to do this. These are critical elements. We can't fight the enemy where the enemy wants us to. We have to make them fight on the terrain that we pick. And then rear, keep the tail in order. Logistics and combat support, deployment of reserves and fire support, continuity of command and control. The Army is starting to understand that all of these things need to be brought together to bear and managed so that we can fight this complete battle. And so the idea was we are going to fight outnumbered and win. We're going to steal the initiative. We're going to keep the enemy off balance and concentrate our power at the right place and the right time. Because one of the ways you deal with a overall strategic smaller numbers than the enemy is you achieve tactical superiority by concentrating your forces where the enemy is weak. Okay. So we already talked about the lessons of the Yom Kippur War and how the deadly new battlefield consumes men and equipment. And so the answer to this was something that the Army called the Big Five. And so over here on the left side of the screen, you see the old weapon systems. You see the M60 main battle tank. You see the Huey helicopter. You see the AH-1 Cobra, the M113 armored personnel carrier, and the old Hawk missiles. Below, over to the right side, you see some weapon systems that were developed at considerable cost. These things were expensive, and it was due to the foresight of Army planners and the Congress and the President of the United States, who decided to make these investments in the M1 Abrams tank, which remains the premier tank on the battlefield today, head and shoulders above the M60. Now, the budget fight is some favored lots of cheap tanks, other favored few excellent tanks. The trade-off is always on speed, firepower, and survivability. The DoD preferred the technical superiority, and they won. The weapons are expensive, but manpower is more expensive. So the M1 tank had better armor, more power and speed due to its turbine engine, which was a gas guzzler. It was quieter. It had a lower profile. It had high-tech armor that could defeat many of the anti-tank weapons deployed against it. It also had laser range finding, computer control, and a stabilized gun, which gave it the capacity to shoot on the move. Prior to that, most tankers had to pause, had to stop moving in order to fire, creates a moment of vulnerability. The M1 keeps moving as it fires. And we also had thermal and infrared imaging, which was a critical component just our night vision gave us a critical edge in Desert Storm. The Bradley down here, which replaced the 113, was able to keep up with the new tanks, and it packed a powerful punch with its 25mm cannon. And it also was capable of carrying anti-aircraft or anti-armor weapons. The AH-6, the AH-64 Apache helicopter was more powerful, more survivable, had better armor. The Cobra was extremely vulnerable to ground fire and had difficulties operating at night. It was capable of nap of the earth maneuverability and had the Hellfire missile, which was a fire and forget, which gave it the tremendous capacity to pop up, launch a missile at a target, and then drop back down out of sight, as opposed to the tow missiles that were that the Cobra carried, which were wire guided and had to be optically tracked until they hit their target. And the UH-60, which just was faster, more powerful, more reliable, and better armor than the Huey. And finally, the famous Patriot missile, which was the first new surface-to-air missile since the 1950s. It's important to understand that the Patriot missile was not specifically designed as an anti-missile missile. It was adapted for that purpose during Desert Storm. And that is a testament to the adaptability of the military, was that they were able, once they realized the threat of the Scuds, they were able to adapt that missile for that purpose and have it work so successfully. At the same time, you have what I call the Little Five, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but we had a new rifle. We had a new basic transportation in the Humvee. We had new meals. We got away from the C rations into the MREs, and new helmets and new uniforms. So visually, the Army is becoming a very different thing. So this is not an exhaustive list, but it does show the depth of the overhaul that the Army was undergoing. Everything is going to be new, from the doctrine to the uniforms the soldiers are wearing. We're creating a brand new Army and getting them ready to fight. The Army reviewed its command structure. It reviewed its strategic needs, its total force, and it reviewed its training strategy. And so what you have is down here, this is a good little graphic that shows the total force doctrine, where you see how the units are spread out between the reserves and National Guard. So for example, our combat power, 46% was in the regular Army, 46% was in the National Guard, and 8% was in the reserves. When you get over to combat service support, you see that 44% of that is in the reserves and 24% of that is in the National Guard. So the Army is switching, and same thing with combat support, is the majority of that is in the reserve components, either the Guard or the Army Reserves. And so this is saving money, which is very badly needed to develop these new weapon systems, but it's also creating a reservoir that the Army can draw on when they go to war. Training, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about the training, but there were some critical changes in the way the Army was training. One is the creation of some really good leadership schools for NCOs and officers. And the idea being that you have to train them how to be leaders. You have to train them how to be flexible. You have to train them to be technically and tactically competent, particularly the NCOs, the backbone, the sergeants who are the backbone of the Army. They need to know their jobs inside and out. They need to know not just the technical aspects and if this happens, you do this. They need to understand tactics. They need to understand the mission. They need to understand their goals, because innovation on the battlefield becomes critical. As soon as the bullets start flying, most plans go right out the window, and it's critical for those NCOs who are on the front lines to be able to say, okay, I understand what the mission is. I understand what my men and my equipment are capable of, so that we can make those changes and get the job done. This became a critical component and of what the Army did in the Gulf War, and the Patriot missile is just one example of soldiers at all levels who adapted. They understood what the mission was, they understood what they were supposed to be doing, and they understand their role was to accomplish that mission using the tools at hand. And they were able to adapt. Almost everything we did in Desert Storm had a component of improvisation to it, because we had not planned on how to do it that way. A few of the things that happened, we developed the National Training Center and dedicated ourselves to training in the most realistic way possible. And so we developed an evaluation system to send a unit to the field and evaluate how they did. And if they didn't do well enough, they said, okay, you're going to train up and you're going to do this again and again and again. And this is opposed to the sort of the old way of doing it was, okay, we did the training, we can check that off the list. No, the Army is not just sending you out there to do training. The Army is also evaluating where your weaknesses are and making sure that you get brought up to a standard. And so we had the National Training Center out at Fort Irwin, and lots of things going on for officers at the War College and whatnot. Then we had exercises like Team Spirit in Korea, Reforgers, the return of forces to Germany, and Bright Star in the Middle East, where we practice moving units to faraway places and having them train on unfamiliar terrain. So as we do these things in the 17-year period, the Army is gaining expertise. How do we do these things? I believe it was Eisenhower who said that plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. Planning is indispensable in the same way that training is indispensable. You learn how things work so that when the time comes, you're able to create a new plan to deal with the contingencies of the situation. In Grenada, we discovered some of the problems with joint operations, some of the difficulties that the Army has communicating with the other services that they need to coordinate with. As the pace of the battle increases, becomes more and more critical that we be able to have these communications. And then Panama revealed that progress in joint operations was being made. But Desert Storm would become the big test of weapons, equipment, and a doctrine that had never been tested in battle before. But it's critical to understand that part of the reason we were so successful in Desert Storm is we spent 17 years preparing for it. I sometimes run into Cold War veterans who were in the Army at the time or got out just before Desert Storm or had been in a few years earlier, and they kind of say, gee, you know, we missed out on the big event. And I tell them time and time again, I say, you didn't miss out on anything. You prepared the Army for what the Army needed to do. When we first put these new weapon systems out into the field, we didn't know how to use them. We had to learn how to use them. We had to take this training doctrine and put it to the test. And where it didn't work, we had to fix it. And that was done through the toil and sweat of millions and millions of soldiers who went out and said, how do I fly this helicopter? How do I operate this tank? How do we work this infantry fighting vehicle? How do we figure this out so that when the balloon goes up, we're ready? And so this was a huge effort. And I think it's easy for us to look at and say, well, it was our technological superiority. We were up against a second-rate Army or whatever. I don't believe that tells the entire story. The story includes these 17 years of hard work and preparation, millions of soldiers, hundreds of leaders focusing on how we're going to do this, how we're going to fight this next war without taking a really heavy blow to the chin before it gets started. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time because I'm mindful of the time. We've been out for about 40 minutes here. But basically, with the end of the Cold War, we started seeing the resurgence of these regional conflicts that had been constrained by both the active restraint of the major powers and also fear of escalation. Throughout the Cold War, those of us who lived through it remembered every little brush fire, every little brush war out there, you know, oh, what's going to happen? Well, if the Soviets get involved, if we get involved, there's a possibility that this could escalate to nuclear war. So that kind of tends to put a damper on these things. But with the Cold War coming to an end this sort of, not quite a power vacuum, but sort of uncertainty about how the post-Cold War world is going to work, Saddam Hussein saw an opportunity. The Iran-Iraq war had ended. So he didn't have that concern anymore. And his relations with Kuwait were problematic. Kuwait, they owed Kuwait a lot of money. Kuwait was demanding repayment. Iraq was asking for more time to make a repayment, and Kuwait was telling them no. The Iraqis, they had tremendous debt and couldn't pay their debts. They also had a historical claim. They saw Kuwait as a breakaway province, as an additional province of Iraq. And they saw all that oil there and said, gee, we could sure use that oil. That would help us pay off our debts. And of course, the added benefit of grabbing a port on the Persian Gulf and the prestige that they perceived they could gain from taking this action. And so August 2nd, 1990, Saddam made his move and grabbed Kuwait. And of course, I think he was probably surprised by the global reaction. And the world said, no, we're not going to. President Bush said, this will not stand. And the world's, got back behind him and said, no, we agree. Israel was the potential fly in the ointment. What's going to happen if Israel gets involved? And a big part of what Saddam did with his Scud missiles was try to pull Israel into the conflict, which would threaten the coalition. But President Bush put together an unprecedented coalition of nations. It was very surprising to me to be out there in the desert with Egyptian forces, with Syrian forces. I mean, you think about that today in our relationship with Syria. We're out there in the desert with Syrian tanks, Soviet equipment that we had been training to target and destroy, and now these things are our allies. So it's really a remarkable coalition. Desert Shield involved the rapid deployment of the 18th Airborne Corps. This is in 2 months, 120,000 troops, 700 tanks, 1,400 armored personnel carriers, 4 divisions. These are light forces, and they took up a defensive position near Kuwait, right in this area, because the fear was that the Iraqis would take us. Okay, I'm sorry, you probably can't see that right here. The fear was that the Iraqis would strike out for Riyadh and try to capture the Saudi oil fields as well. So they set up what is called a defense in depth, waiting to see what the Iraqi army was going to do. The Iraqi army was quite capable. They were the 4th largest army in the world. They had lots of experience. As it turned out, they were not really up to our standards, but particularly in those early months when all we had was the light forces of the 18th Airborne Corps. That's a couple infantry divisions and not much else. They probably could have stopped an attack, but the cost in personnel would have been high. At this point, by November, President Bush made the decision to liberate Kuwait by force if diplomatic efforts continue to fail. So we started making our plans, which called for a direct assault rather than an enveloping attack. So a few months after that, it's a few weeks after that, really, that Schwarzkopf went to Washington and said, look, if we're going to do this right, I'm going to need another corps. But that was some really tense times. There were some alerts when they thought that the Iraqis were coming, and it was really very nervous. I've talked to some of the soldiers who were there at the time, and they were really very nervous about what might happen. So just to give you an idea, here's the picture of the theater. We'll have another look at this, but we were concerned right here. I want to point out something. This is the Wadi al-Batin, which you'll hear about again a little bit. And again, I'm still mindful of the time. I think I'm going over. But the Wadi al-Batin is a dry riverbed, usually dry riverbed, and it's one of the main navigational features out there in the desert. And one of the reasons why we were able to successfully pull off the left hook was the Iraqis were convinced that navigation through the desert simply wasn't possible. They didn't think we could do it. They didn't think the desert had been swallowing up armies for thousands of years. And so, with GPS, we were able to do it. But they didn't think we'd be able to do it. Okay. Not going to go into, because of the time, I'm not going to go into a tremendous amount about the air war. You pretty much know the story there. We had air superiority. We took out their air defense capabilities. Their Air Force fled to and took shelter in Iran. We used our air superiority to go after the command and control, the communications, to isolate, stop supplies from getting to the theater, and ground to attrit the ground forces. A significant portion after the Scud missiles started being fired at Israel, a significant portion of our air power was put on the mission of hunting Scuds. So we had to promise Israel that we would stop those to keep them from joining into the war, which I mentioned because while we did have overwhelming force, our resources were still limited. The ground force attrition was simply not what our commanders wanted it to be by the time H-hour arrived and we had to go. But we were still confident. We were still, they were actually expecting significant casualties, and we're pleasantly surprised by what we were able to do there. One of the things that was very useful was the isolation. We stopped the flow of supplies, which meant the Iraqis were not big on maneuvering. They're running low on gasoline, so they're not moving their tanks around. Well, tanks tend to break down if they're allowed to just sit. Their batteries go dead. The crews get lazy, get rusty, and so that had a significant effect on them. They weren't able to move around, and they were just it made them reactive instead of proactive. All right. Let's take a look at the ground war. Again, the Iraqis expected this assault up the Wadi al-Batin. They didn't expect us to be able to navigate in the desert. What we did is we continued the air war until such time as we were convinced that we could move and array our forces and get ready for this attack without them becoming aware of it. So it was really in the last couple of weeks that 7th Corps, which had come over from Germany, began moving into to the west, along a lot of it along Tap Line Road. Part of what I did driving a truck was haul some of their supplies and equipment to get them in position for this left hook, to outflank, to go around the bulk of the Iraqi forces. So Norman Schwarzkopf made the final decision to do the enveloping attack, knowing that we could move 7th Corps without being able to, without being spotted. Now, the assault did include some demonstrations, some feints. The 1st Cavalry Division feinted up the Wadi to fulfill Iraqi expectations. That did fool them. So that was tremendous. The Marines did a demonstration. They laid off the coastline, tying down several Iraqi divisions who thought we were going to do an amphibious landing. And then they did, they eventually landed behind friendly lines and served as operational reserves. Joint Forces Command North here, coalition forces, undertook the actual mission of liberating the city of Kuwait. The decision was made that Arab forces would liberate the city, which was it was done for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is having the ability to communicate directly with the locals was a tremendous advantage. And so we met Iraqi expectations. We pinned the Iraqi forces in place with our air power, but air power did not do the job of removing the Iraqi forces from Kuwait. And that is something that is sometimes a misconception that people have. We still needed to go in there and kick them out, and it was a very difficult task. But again, the Iraqis had been devastated to the point where they were almost ineffective. Really the Republican Guards which was just about a portion of their force, was really the only force left that was capable of any kind of effective action. They didn't understand our night vision capabilities. They didn't understand our surveillance capabilities. We were able to detect them at a distance. Our Apaches could detect and destroy a tank at 8 kilometers. And so our advance was very quick, and most of the fighting was over very, very quickly. As soon as we spotted them, we would destroy them and continue moving. The main attack had the goal of targeting the Iraqi army center of gravity, which was the Republican Guard, and the goal was to cut it off and kill it. The ground attack validated the assertion that air power alone could not win the war. The Republican Guards remained a viable fighting force, and it was only our superior training and equipment that kept our casualties low. Our soldiers and equipment were that good. We spotted them before they spotted us, and we destroyed them usually before they even knew we were there. All the post-Vietnam reforms were validated, from command and control to training to night vision technology. Allied forces suffered only 257 killed in action. 148 of those were Americans, versus 20,000 or more Iraqis killed and 50,000 wounded or captured. By the time we got there, the regular Iraqi line units, that were full of conscripted soldiers, were so demoralized. They hadn't had proper food. They didn't have proper water. They had been left out there in the desert, out of communication with their commanders. They surrendered en masse, and we took tens and tens of thousands of casualties. So the aftermath, what happened next? We reached our objectives, and the ceasefire was called. A few days later, the ceasefire was formalized when Schwarzkopf met with the Iraqis. The Iraqis came in kind of blustery to that meeting, ready to make a bunch of demands, and Schwarzkopf basically told them, if you don't, here's what our conditions are, you will agree to all of them or you will be completely destroyed. And the Iraqis really had no choice but to accept that. There were failed uprisings in the north and the south of Iraq. Very sad story. We were not really, in many cases, American soldiers sat and watched the brutal repression of that. But for a variety of reasons, President Bush decided we had achieved our mission of liberating Kuwait, and he was not going to extend that mission into overthrowing Saddam or supporting these uprisings. The hope was that the uprisings would succeed, but unfortunately they did not. Public opinion, of course, it was a tremendous reception at home. Everybody was thrilled with the outcome. Unfortunately, I believe that led to a number of mistaken conclusions about the capability of the Army to accomplish great things. We did have very limited very limited objectives in Desert Storm, and we achieved them. And it was through stopping there that we solidified our victory. It meant we had to sit and watch some terrible things happen to innocent people, but it also meant that we didn't get pulled into something else that maybe would not have had such a good outcome as our initial mission. I think that it has left the American public with a bit of a exaggerated perception of what military force is capable of. I believe that it was the high point of American power, and that point lasted until Somalia in 1993 and our defeat at the Battle of Mogadishu. More of the Republican Guard escaped than was initially thought, and it's not clear on who or what is to blame. The slaughter on the Highway of Death was a potential public relations disaster and did play a part in President Bush's decision to cease hostilities, but it may have been exaggerated. So that's really the end of my presentation. And I will say the one thing that I'd like to leave you with is, if you take nothing away from this, think that was Desert Storm easy? And I would say, no, it wasn't. We trained for it for 17 years. So thank you. And I'll take your questions.
Okay, Jeff, thanks very much for